Boatswain's mate first class, James Elliott Williams, heard the enemy before he saw them. His men called him the Old Man, which was a joke, because at 36 he was barely old at all. He just looked it next to a crew of teenagers. The Navy had handed him 2 small fiberglass boats, a stretch of the Mekong that no one could truly hold, and a mission that in plain language meant one thing: deny these waters to the enemy, or watch the richest part of South Vietnam bleed out one canal at a time. The Viet Cong were moving on the water that afternoon, and nearly every advantage on the river belonged to them. The men who owned these canals had been ambushing patrol boats like his for months, and those boats had learned the hard way that fiberglass does not stop a rocket. The air over the water smelled of diesel and river mud, and the green rot of the mangroves. Williams had 2 boats, a handful of young sailors, and open water in every direction. It was October 31, 1966. The river he was patrolling was one thread in a vast web. 3,000 nautical miles of rivers, canals, and streams laced the southern half of South Vietnam. The Mekong Delta was the country's rice bowl, home to nearly half of its entire population, and on this particular afternoon, the men who truly ruled that water were not the government in Saigon, and they were not the Americans. They were the Viet Cong, and they had ruled it for years. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favor. Cold War Impact is a small history channel, and lately our reach and our views have slipped. If you value carefully researched military history like this, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing the video. Every single interaction helps this channel find new viewers, and it lets me keep making these deep dive documentaries. Now, back to the Mekong. For years, the waterways of the Delta had belonged to the guerrillas. They moved men and rice and ammunition along the canals under cover of darkness. They taxed the sampans of ordinary farmers. They mined the channels and waited in the tree lines with rockets and machine guns. Very little that the Allied forces tried seemed to loosen their grip. And then, over roughly 3 hours on the last day of October, 2 patrol boats under the command of 1 enlisted sailor tore the heart out of a major Viet Cong river movement and left 65 enemy boats destroyed or sunk behind them. The weapon that finally cracked open the enemy's hold on that stretch of river was not a battleship. It was not a bomber, and it was not a secret prototype rushed in from a laboratory. It was a 31-foot plastic boat built around what was, in essence, a swimming pool pump. But to understand how 2 of those little boats did what artillery and air power had struggled for so long to do, we have to go back. We have to go back to the problem itself. We have to understand why, in 1966, the most powerful navy on Earth found itself nearly helpless in the shallow brown water of the Mekong Delta. The Delta was not the kind of battlefield the United States Navy had been built to fight in. The Navy of 1965 was a navy of aircraft carriers and cruisers and deep blue water. It thought in terms of oceans and horizons. What it faced in the far south of Vietnam was the exact opposite of an ocean. It was a flat, drowned maze. The Mekong River split into branch after branch as it slowed and spread toward the sea. Between those branches lay thousands of miles of natural streams and man-made canals, many of them dug by hand over centuries by farmers who needed to move water and rice. In much of the Delta, there were almost no roads worth the name. The water was the road. If you wanted to move rice, you moved it by boat. If you wanted to move soldiers, you moved them by boat. And if you wanted to control the people of the Delta, and again, nearly half of all South Vietnamese lived here, then you controlled the water. The Viet Cong understood this completely because most of them had grown up on these very canals. They knew which channels flooded with the season and which ones ran to mud. They knew which turns hid a sandbar and which stretch of bank offered a clear field of fire straight across the open water. They used the rivers as highways and as toll booths at the same time. They stopped commercial junks and sampans and taxed the trade. They ferried weapons down from the Cambodian border along quiet inland routes. They floated entire units from one operation to the next, while the government forces slept. For the guerrilla, the water was sanctuary. For anyone trying to hunt that guerrilla, the water was a trap. And it was a trap in the most literal, physical sense. The banks of a delta canal often stood higher than a boat's deck. Thick vegetation crowded right down to the waterline. A patrol boat pushing up a narrow channel was funneled into a killing zone with nowhere to turn and nowhere to hide. The enemy's favorite weapon in that kind of fight was the B-40, a shoulder-fired rocket that could punch straight through a boat's thin hull and gut the crew inside in a single blinding flash. Recoilless rifles waited inside bunkers dug into the mud of the banks. Machine guns and riflemen lined the tree lines. The Viet Cong did not need to win a long, grinding battle on the water. They needed one rocket, one burst, one moment of surprise. Then they melted back into the paddies and the palm groves before help could ever arrive. Whole patrols could be shredded in a matter of seconds on water that looked, from the air, completely peaceful. Just how dangerous that work was can be measured in plain numbers. The patrol boat crews of the Delta fought, on average, more than 80 firefights in a single month. Over the course of a one-year tour, the odds caught up with a great many of them. Across the whole of the river patrol effort, something close to 1 in 3 of these sailors would be killed or wounded before they went home. They knew those odds when they climbed aboard. They went out anyway, day after day, night after night, into the most dangerous stretches of water in the entire war. That was the environment. Now consider what the United States actually had to fight in it. In the middle of 1965, the honest answer was almost nothing. The South Vietnamese Navy had a small river force, brave but overmatched and stretched impossibly thin across an impossible amount of water. The Americans had a great and powerful navy sitting offshore, and that navy could not follow the enemy up a canal that was only 4 feet deep. The gap between those two facts was exactly where the Viet Cong lived and thrived. As long as that gap remained open, the guerrillas could move almost at will through the most populated and most productive region of the entire country. They could feed themselves from the Delta's rice harvest. They could recruit from its crowded villages. They could threaten Saigon itself from the south. The water was the enemy's single greatest asset, and for a long and painful stretch of the war, no one had found a way to take it away from him. The first serious American answer to the infiltration problem did not begin on the rivers at all. It began out at sea. Early in 1965, the Navy launched a coastal patrol effort known as Operation Market Time, aimed at cutting off the flow of weapons and supplies that the enemy was shipping down the long South Vietnamese coastline by sea. The trigger for it was stark. In early 1965, a large enemy trawler packed with weapons was discovered and destroyed at a place called Vung Ro Bay, proof that the enemy was moving tons of munitions in by sea, right along the coast, more or less unopposed. Market Time was the response. It put patrol craft, larger ships, and aircraft along more than 1,000 miles of coastline, layer upon layer, to search the endless traffic of junks and sampans, and to intercept the trawlers before they could land their cargo. Over time, it grew genuinely effective at strangling the seaborne supply routes. But Market Time revealed a hard truth even as it succeeded. When you close the coast, the enemy does not give up. He adapts. He simply shifts more of his traffic inland, onto the rivers and canals where a saltwater navy cannot follow. Choking the sea only made the inland waterways more important than ever before. The supplies that could no longer come ashore directly began flowing down through other routes and into the delta along the very rivers the Viet Cong already controlled. And those inland waterways were precisely where the United States had almost no capability at all. The success of one campaign had exposed the emptiness of another. Sealing the coast without sealing the rivers was like locking the front door of a house while leaving every window wide open. The men in Washington and Saigon understood the problem well enough. Solving it was another matter entirely. You could not fight a canal war with destroyers. You needed something small. You needed something fast. You needed something that drew almost no water at all and could go wherever the sampans went. You needed a boat that could run in the weeds and the mud, turn around inside its own length, and still carry enough firepower to win a close, brutal, point-blank fight against an enemy who chose the time and place. Such a boat did not exist in the Navy's inventory. It had to be found, and it had to be found quickly, because every single month that the Viet Cong owned the Delta was another month closer to losing the countryside, and perhaps the country, for good. The answer, when it finally came, did not come from a shipyard drafting a warship. It came, in large part, from the world of pleasure boats. In the autumn of 1965, the Navy went looking for a commercial hull it could adapt for war, and it found the shape of its answer in a small fiberglass craft designed for civilian recreation. What the Navy built from that starting point became the patrol boat, River. Every man who served on the Delta would come to know it by three plain letters, PBR. The patrol boat, River, was just 31 feet long in its first version. It did not look like a warship at all. It looked like something a wealthy man might use to cross a calm lake on a Sunday, but the heart of it was what made it so deadly in the Delta. Instead of propellers hanging down below the hull, which would have snagged and shattered on every sandbar and weed bed in the region, the boat was driven by water jets. Its diesel engines sucked river water in through the bottom and blasted it out the stern, pushing the boat forward with nothing exposed beneath the keel. Fully loaded, the boat drew only about 2 feet of water. At speed, it drew even less than that, skimming across shallows that would have grounded almost anything else afloat. It could run at better than 25 knots. It could spin around inside its own length. It could stop nearly dead from full speed, and then leap forward again in the space of a heartbeat. In a canal barely wider than the boat itself, that kind of agility was the difference between living and dying. For a crew, the patrol boat, River, usually carried 4 sailors. There was a boat captain, most often a first-class petty officer. There was a gunner, an engineman, and a seaman, and every one of them was expected to fight when the moment came. The firepower packed onto so small a hull was heavy and concentrated. Forward sat an open tub with twin 50-caliber machine guns, able to swing across an arc and hammer a riverbank with a wall of half-inch slugs. Aft sat a single 50-caliber gun. Between them, the crew worked lighter machine guns, a grenade launcher, and their own rifles. A patrol boat, River, could not take a hit well. Its fiberglass hull offered almost no protection to the men inside, but it could deliver a stunning volume of fire, and it could do so while moving fast enough to throw off an enemy gunner's aim. Its survival depended on 3 things: speed, surprise, and the raw nerve of the men aboard. The boat was not perfect, and the men who took it into combat learned its flaws quickly. The water jet drives that gave it such freedom in the shallows would clog with mud and weed and torn vegetation, and a fouled drive in the middle of a firefight was a nightmare. The early model boats were refined based on hard experience, and an improved version soon followed, a little longer, a little wider, with better drives and tougher fittings. But no amount of refinement could change the basic bargain the crews had accepted. They were riding into ambush country in a hull that would not stop a bullet, let alone a rocket, and they were trusting their lives to speed and aggression and each other. That bargain took a particular kind of sailor. The Navy found that those sailors existed. The boats did not fight alone. Watching over them from the sky were the helicopter gunships that the river sailors came to love more than almost anything else in that war. These were Navy Hueys, armed and ready to roll in low over the water at a moment's notice. When a patrol boat was pinned down in a narrow canal and taking fire from 3 sides at once, it was often those gunships who came screaming in, their rockets and machine guns tearing into the ambushes and buying the boats the precious seconds they needed to break free. In these early months, the detachments flying those helicopters over the Delta were still borrowing aircraft from the Army and finding their feet. Within a few months, in the spring of 1967, they would be formally gathered into their own squadron and take a name that would become legend on the rivers. The Seawolves, but the bond they shared with the boat crews was already being forged, fight by fight. A boat crew in serious trouble learned that if they could just hold on a little longer, the helicopters would come. That faith was not misplaced, and it was paid for in the blood of the men who flew. Over the course of the war, the men who flew those gunships scrambled again and again, in daylight and in darkness, in any weather, to reach sailors in trouble. They paid a heavy price for it. Dozens of them were killed, and many more were wounded, and their squadron became one of the most decorated Navy units of the entire war. To a river sailor, none of those statistics mattered nearly as much as one simple fact. When you called, they came. In a war with very little that felt certain, that certainty was worth more than gold. To put these boats and these aircraft to work, the Navy created a brand new force with a brand new mission. On December 18, 1965, it established the River Patrol Force, known within the fleet by its Task Force Number 116. The operation it would carry out had a name that captured its purpose perfectly. Game Warden. A game warden patrols a wild stretch of country, enforces the law there, and denies the poacher his free run of the land. That was the idea on the rivers as well. The river sailors would patrol the delta's waterways, enforce curfews on the water, search suspicious craft, choke off the flow of enemy men and weapons, and slowly, patrol by patrol, take the water away from the Viet Cong. It was a mission measured not in grand set-piece battles but in thousands of small, dangerous, exhausting encounters, day after day, night after night, on water where the enemy almost always saw you first. The patrol boats did more than watch the water too. When Navy commando teams needed to slip into enemy country and slip back out again, it was often a patrol boat that carried them in and carried them home. The boats inserted and extracted the small raiding teams that struck at the enemy deep in his own sanctuary, waiting in the dark for a signal, then racing in to pull the men out under fire if the mission went wrong. It was one more thread in the same web. Whatever needed doing on the narrow water, the river force found itself doing it. Game Warden did not begin as a mighty armada. It began small, with a handful of boats and men learning a kind of warfare that no manual had ever fully described. In those early months, the sailors were writing the tactics as they went, discovering by trial and error how to run a river at night, how to set an ambush of their own along a bank, how to search a sampan without being lured into a trap, how to fight their way out of a canal when the banks came alive with fire. There were mistakes, and some of them were paid for in blood, but the force grew, and it learned, and by the time it reached its full size, it counted hundreds of patrol boats and thousands of men. What had started as a desperate improvisation was becoming a genuine instrument of war. And a few of the men learning that trade in 1966 would turn out to be among the finest small boat fighters the Navy ever produced. Into this new force, in the spring of 1966, came a boatswain's mate from South Carolina named James Elliott Williams. He was in his mid-30s, and he was not a green recruit. He had joined the Navy as a teenager, so young in fact that he had to work around the age rules to get himself in the door. He had already been to one war before this one, in Korea, where he served aboard a destroyer. That earlier war had taught him lessons that no amount of peacetime training could ever match. He learned what it felt like to operate in a combat zone, to keep his head when the shooting started, to trust the men around him, and to be trusted in return. He carried those lessons with him for the rest of his life. He was tough, weathered, and completely at home on the water. He knew boats the way an old farmer knows the shape of his own fields. When he reached Vietnam and took command of a patrol boat on the rivers of the Delta, he brought with him years of hard sea time and a kind of steadiness that simply cannot be taught in a classroom. His men trusted him for a simple reason. He had earned it. His boat was Patrol Boat River 105. He had a habit that told you something about the man. He had stripped much of the armor off of her. Armor was weight, and weight was speed lost. And on the rivers, Williams had decided that speed would keep his crew alive more reliably than a few plates of ceramic and steel. With the help of his engineman, he had coaxed that boat up past 30 knots, faster than she had any right to go. It was a gambler's choice, trading protection for pace, and it fit him. He would rather be the fastest thing on the river than the best armored wreck at the bottom of it. By the autumn of 1966, Williams and men like him had spent months learning the brutal rhythm of the river war. They had learned that a lazy, quiet afternoon could explode into a firefight in a single heartbeat. They had learned to read the banks, to watch for the unnatural stillness of a village where all the people had suddenly vanished, because vanished people almost always meant that an ambush had been set, and everyone with sense had cleared out. They had learned just how quickly a patrol boat could die, and they had learned that the only real defense was to hit back harder and faster than the enemy ever expected. This was the hard education written in the losses of the river force, in boats shot to splinters and crews carried home under flags. It was an education paid for in blood, and it was the reason that when the single biggest fight of James Williams's life finally came for him, he was ready to meet it. Because the Viet Cong were not standing still either. All through 1966 they kept moving on the water, and they kept moving in real strength. The guerrilla forces of the Delta needed to gather men and supplies to mount their operations, and the rivers were how they did it. Somewhere up the branches and side canals off the main river, units assembled in the shadows, boats were loaded down with troops and weapons, and staging areas filled with sampans and junks. To the Viet Cong, these gatherings were routine and safe. They had done exactly this for years without anyone strong enough or bold enough to stop them. They had no reason to believe that anything had changed. That confidence, built on years of ruling the water unopposed, was about to run head-on into two small boats and a man who flatly refused to run. It was supposed to be a quiet day. Williams remembered it plainly in later years. It was meant to be a restful patrol in the steamy heartland of the Viet Cong, the ordinary work of checking river traffic and moving on. As he put it long afterward, it was one of those days he could never forget, no matter how hard he tried. On the afternoon of October 31, 1966, he led a two-boat patrol along the Mai Thu River, one of the great branches of the Mekong, in the country near the town of My Thu. He rowed in the lead boat. A second patrol boat ran alongside him. Two boats, a small band of young sailors, and the wide brown river stretching out ahead. They were, in Williams's own words, just moseying on down the river, minding their own business. And then the forward gunner hollered that there were two fast boats crossing ahead of them. Two small enemy craft were out on the water ahead, moving fast. Fast boats usually meant important men aboard, and the enemy opened fire as they ran. The two sampans split apart, one breaking one way and one the other. Williams turned his boats after them and opened fire. One of the sampans was hit and sunk. But the second craft did not surrender, and it did not stop. It ran. It fled straight into the mouth of a narrow canal, a channel only about 8 feet wide, far too tight and too shallow for the patrol boats to chase directly. On an ordinary patrol, that might well have been the end of it. The enemy craft would slip away up the canal, and the sailors would turn and move on to the next stretch of river. But James Williams knew this water. Months of hard patrolling had burned the geography of these channels into his memory. He checked his map, and he knew a way around. Rather than let the enemy simply vanish, he pushed his boats at full speed down a parallel route to cut the fleeing sampan off at the far end. It was an aggressive choice, and it was the choice that turned an ordinary afternoon into one of the most extraordinary small boat actions in the entire history of the United States Navy. Because when Williams brought his boats around a corner and into that connecting waterway, he did not find a single frightened sampan trying to escape. In his own blunt words, he looked up and saw nothing but boats and people, and more boats and more people. He had driven straight into the middle of a Viet Cong staging area. The water ahead of him was crowded with enemy boats. Junks and sampans, loaded down with troops and supplies, filled the channel from bank to bank. Williams had blundered directly into a concentration of Viet Cong, far larger than anything two patrol boats were ever meant to face. For a single frozen moment, the two sides simply stared at one another in mutual shock, the American sailors and the guerrillas, at a range so close there was no time left to think. And then both sides opened fire at the very same instant. The volume of fire that erupted was staggering. The twin .50 calibers on the bows of the patrol boats opened up and swept across the enemy craft, and the enemy fired back with everything they had, from the boats and from the banks on both sides. Williams did the only thing that could possibly save his crews caught in that trap. He attacked. He drove his boats straight through the enemy concentration at full speed, guns hammering the whole way, throwing a great wake to spoil the enemy's aim and keep the Viet Cong off balance. It worked better than he had any right to expect. As he remembered it, the enemy's aim was so rattled that day that they hit more of each other than they hit his boats. To slow down in that channel was to die. To stop was to be swarmed and overwhelmed. So he did not slow, and he did not stop. He powered clean through the staging area, his gunners cutting into sampan after sampan, and burst out the far side, only to discover that the fight had barely even begun. Because beyond that first concentration of boats lay a second one, even larger than the first. Williams had not stumbled onto a lone staging area. He had stumbled onto a major Viet Cong movement in the very middle of assembling itself, spread out across the waterways, a mass of fighters and dozens upon dozens of boats. The sheer scale of it would have been reason enough for two patrol boats to break contact and run flat out for their lives. Instead, Williams made a decision that came to define the entire action. He would not let this force escape untouched. He called for help, and he kept right on fighting. He radioed for the helicopter gunships. They lifted off and raced toward his coordinates, and while he waited for them to arrive, Williams kept his boats hard in the fight. He maneuvered, he fired, and he refused to give the enemy the room or the time to get organized. As he twisted and turned his boat through the fire, he did whatever he could to keep the enemy off his back. When the gunships finally arrived overhead, the battle swelled into something enormous. From the water, the patrol boats poured fire into the massed enemy craft and into the banks. From the air, the helicopters rolled in with rockets and machine guns, tearing into the packed boats and the fighters ashore. Together, the sailors and the airmen worked methodically through that sprawling target, boat by boat, position by position. There was a moment, as the fight raged, when the situation seemed too hot and a withdrawal made sense. But Williams was not willing to leave the job unfinished. When one of the helicopters turned to lead him back out of the worst of it, he refused to be pulled off the enemy while so much of the target remained. He turned his boat around and went back in, and it was on that second push that his guns reached the heaviest of the enemy's loaded supply junks and blew them apart. That refusal to quit while the enemy still floated was the thread that ran through the entire action. The fight stretched on, not for minutes but for hours. Through all of it, Williams drove his boats back and forth along the waterways, hunting the enemy craft, pushing through fire that would have broken a lesser crew and a lesser man. The engagement ranged across the channels as the Viet Cong tried desperately to scatter and slip away, and the patrol boats and helicopters ran them down. It was close, and it was chaotic, and it was utterly unrelenting. Williams himself was wounded and kept fighting. His crewmen took hits and kept firing their guns. Through the whole long ordeal, not one American boat was lost, not one American sailor was killed. As Williams marveled years later, on that first wild day they had been blasted to hell and back, and somehow nobody died. As the fight wore on, the afternoon light began to fail, and with the coming of darkness, Williams faced one final, brutal choice. In the failing light, he could no longer clearly see the enemy craft he was still hunting, which meant he could no longer finish the job he had started. So he did something that turned the entire logic of survival on its head. He ordered the searchlights on his boats switched on. In a night action on a river, light is death. Light announces to every rocket team and every machine gunner on the bank exactly where you are and exactly where you are going. By switching on those lights, Williams deliberately made his own two boats the most visible, most inviting targets on the entire river. He did it anyway. He drove in perilously close to the shore, the searchlights blazing out across the black water, pinning the fleeing enemy craft in their beams so that his gunners and the gunships overhead could destroy them. He traded away his own cover, his own safety, for the chance to finish the fight. And he finished it, even as his supply of ammunition ran dangerously low. When that long battle finally burned itself out, the tally on the water was almost beyond belief. Williams's two-boat patrol, working with the gunships overhead, had destroyed or sunk 65 enemy vessels, 65 boats, junks and sampans loaded with troops and supplies. A major Viet Cong river movement shattered in a single afternoon and evening by two small plastic boats and a handful of helicopter crews. The enemy's losses in men were heavy, and the disruption to their operations in that part of the delta was severe. A force that had counted on the water to keep it hidden and safe had been caught out on that very water and torn to pieces. For this action, James Elliott Williams received the Medal of Honor, the highest award his country can bestow. The official citation described how his patrol, in a running battle lasting more than 3 hours, accounted for the destruction or loss of 65 enemy boats and inflicted numerous casualties on the enemy. It described the massed enemy craft, the two staging areas, the call for the helicopter gunships, and that almost unbelievable decision to turn on the searchlights and expose himself to certain fire in order to finish the enemy off. President Lyndon Johnson presented the medal in the spring of 1968 at the dedication of the Hall of Heroes inside the Pentagon. It is worth being very precise about what that famous number, 65, actually counts, because the truth of it is remarkable enough on its own without any exaggeration. 65 is the number of enemy boats destroyed or lost in that action. It is not a body count of men. The citation itself does not put a number on the enemy dead. It says only that the patrol inflicted numerous casualties. In the years since, some accounts have attached much larger figures to that day, estimates running into the hundreds or even 1,000 enemy fighters. Those numbers may hold some truth, but they were never confirmed, and the ground where the fighting happened stayed in enemy hands, so no one could ever count it properly. Williams and his handful of young sailors never needed an inflated legend to make their story matter. The verified, documented fact, 65 enemy vessels wrecked in a single running action by two patrol boats, stands entirely on its own as one of the most lopsided small craft victories of the whole war. That is the number carved into the record, and it is more than enough. To understand why that single afternoon mattered so much, you have to set it against everything that had come before it on those rivers. For years, the Viet Cong had used the delta's water as a sanctuary they could always count on. They had moved when they wished and where they wished, confident in their bones that no one could catch a force of boats deep in the canal country and destroy it. Williams's action was violent, undeniable proof that this was no longer true. The water was no longer automatically safe. A river movement that would once have slipped through the delta completely untouched had instead been found, fixed in place, and annihilated. The message to the guerrilla was as bright and as clear as the searchlights that had lit up that night. The river had a new game warden now, and he would follow you up any canal you dared to run down. That shift did not come from James Williams alone, and he would have been the first man to say so. But his fight became the sharpest symbol of it. All across the delta, the patrol boats of Game Warden were steadily changing the arithmetic of the river war. The Viet Cong now had to start moving more carefully, more slowly, more often at night and in smaller groups, always listening for the low growl of a patrol boat engine and the beat of rotors somewhere in the dark. The freedom they had enjoyed on the water for so many years was being stripped away from them, a canal at a time. And it was being stripped away by ordinary enlisted sailors on small boats, men who went out day after day into ambush country in hulls that a single rocket could destroy, and who kept going out anyway. The river war did not stop with the patrol boats either, because the Americans were building a second, heavier instrument at the same time. The patrol boats of Game Warden were superb at watching the water, searching traffic, and interdicting movement, but they were too light to seize and hold ground. To do that, the Navy and the Army joined forces and created a combined riverine force, pairing Navy boat crews with Army infantry in a single fighting team. The Navy provided armored troop carriers, converted from landing craft and plated with steel and bar armor to shrug off rockets, along with monitors that served as the artillery of the rivers, mounting cannon and heavy guns. The Army provided the soldiers who rode inside those armored boats. Together, they could appear almost anywhere in the delta, land infantry directly onto a hostile bank, support them with a wall of gunfire from the water, and then lift them out again when the work was done. This combined force operated from bases that floated on the rivers themselves, and from a land base carved out of the delta mud near the town of Mui Tho, a place called Dong Tam. The name was chosen to carry the idea of united hearts, a fitting notion for a force that welded sailors and soldiers into one team. From these bases, the riverine force pushed into some of the hardest enemy country in the delta, fighting through canals and rice paddies and tree lines where the Viet Cong had ruled unchallenged for years. Where Game Warden patrolled and interdicted, this heavier force brought concentrated combat power to bear and could stay and fight for the ground. Between the two of them, the patrollers and the assault force, the delta that the Viet Cong had once crossed at will was becoming, month by month, a far more dangerous place for them to move. The true test of everything the Navy had built on those rivers came at the very start of 1968. During the Lunar New Year holiday, the enemy launched a massive, coordinated offensive across the whole of South Vietnam, striking cities and bases everywhere at once in what became known as the Tet Offensive. In the delta, towns that had felt secure suddenly found themselves under attack, and the river forces were thrown into the fight to help take them back. The mobility that the boats provided proved its worth in those desperate weeks. Sailors ferried troops to threatened towns, fought to clear enemy forces from built-up areas, and kept the vital waterways open when the roads were cut. The offensive was, in the end, a crushing tactical defeat for the enemy, who suffered appalling losses for very little lasting gain on the ground. And the river forces had shown, under the hardest possible conditions, that they had become an indispensable part of holding the delta together. But none of this came cheaply, and the cost of the river war was real and paid in full. The patrol boats were fragile things, and the enemy was skilled and patient, and the ambushes never truly stopped. Williams's own river section knew that cost in the most intimate way possible. On the 24th of May, 1967, a two-boat patrol from that same unit was ambushed on the Ham Luong River, another branch of the Mekong, a few miles south of the town of Ben Tre. The lead boat was struck almost at once by a recoilless rifle round, and in the space of a few violent seconds, the officer in charge and 2 of his crew were killed. Machine gun fire cut down a 4th man as the boat swerved out of control. The second boat fought to cover the withdrawal and was hit as well, and a Vietnamese policeman riding aboard was killed in the exchange. 4 American sailors dead in a single ambush. Their names were Charles Witt, Roy Castleberry, Michael Quinn, and Terry Leeser. It was a stark reminder, written in the loss of shipmates, that no victory on that water was ever permanent, and no stretch of river was ever truly won. The triumph of October 31 had not made the Delta safe. It had made it contested, and contested was itself a kind of revolution after years of the enemy owning the water outright and unchallenged. But every patrol that followed still ran the very same risks. Every crew still went out knowing that a silent, peaceful-looking bank might erupt into fire at any second. The men of the river force lived with that knowledge every single day and did their work anyway. That quiet, daily, unglamorous courage was the true foundation on which dramatic victories like Williams's were actually built. James Elliott Williams himself became, by the end of his years of service, the most decorated enlisted sailor in the entire history of the United States Navy. Beyond the Medal of Honor, he was awarded the Navy Cross, which is the second highest award for valor that exists. He earned 2 Silver Stars. He earned the Legion of Merit. He earned 3 Bronze Stars and 3 Purple Hearts for the wounds he suffered, and a long list of other decorations besides. Very few men in the nation's history have ever assembled such a record of valor, and fewer still have done it while remaining, at heart, a plain working sailor. And yet the man behind that extraordinary record never cared for the spotlight. As he said of the medal in later years, he had just been doing a job to the best of his ability. He was not out there trying to win medals. Events, he said, just happened. He believed in his boats, in his crews, and in the plain hard work of the river, and he believed above all in the idea of the team. It takes a team to win any battle, he liked to say, not one man. When his Navy career finally came to an end, Williams did not go chasing after fame. He returned home to South Carolina, the state he had come from, and he continued to serve, only now in a different uniform. He became a United States Marshal. He carried into that new work the very same steadiness that had carried him through the staging areas of the Mekong. For years, many Americans had absolutely no idea that a quiet, unassuming man doing law enforcement work in the Carolinas had once, on a single October afternoon, fought one of the most remarkable boat actions in his nation's naval history. That was entirely in keeping with the kind of man he was. The river sailors of Vietnam had served in a war that a tired and divided nation would spend decades struggling to remember clearly, and their particular corner of that war, the Brown Water War fought in the shallows, was understood even less than most of it. Williams wore his honors without noise and without fuss. He lived until the autumn of 1999, and he was laid to rest in his home state. But his story did not end there, at his graveside, because the Navy he had served chose to carry his name forward in the most enduring way that a Navy knows how. It built a warship, and it named her for him, the guided missile destroyer that bears his name, a modern Arleigh Burke-class ship, was christened by his widow and commissioned in the winter of 2004 at Charleston, South Carolina, not far at all from where his own story had first begun. She is a warship of a completely different age. She is a vessel of radars and guided missiles and computers, about as far removed from a 31-foot fiberglass patrol boat as it is possible for anything on the water to be. And yet the thread that connects them is direct and unbroken. Both of them carry the name of a boatswain's mate who once took 2 small boats into a river full of the enemy and did not turn back. A young sailor reporting aboard that destroyer today, learning the name on her hull, is inheriting something that began on a canal in the Mekong Delta. The kind of war that James Williams fought did not simply vanish when Vietnam ended. For a time, the Navy set aside the hard brown water lessons it had learned at such a cost, disbanding its river forces as the war wound down and turning its full attention back to the open ocean it knew best. The Great Blue Water Navy reasserted itself, and the memory of the canals faded. But the need did not disappear along with the units. In the decades that followed, in new wars and on new rivers and in new harbors, the United States found itself needing, once again, sailors who could fight in the shallows, patrol the choke points, and guard the close water where the great grey ships simply could not go. The Navy rebuilt a riverine capability in the 2000s, sending small boat crews to patrol the rivers and guard the dams of Iraq. And the lessons of the Mekong had to be relearned by a new generation. The names and the organizations have shifted across the years, from riverine squadrons to a coastal riverine force to the Maritime Expeditionary Security Force that carries the mission today. But the task at the very heart of it is the same one that the game warden sailors would recognize in an instant. Somebody has to control the narrow water. Somebody has to go where the big ships cannot follow. That is the real inheritance of the Mekong. The Viet Cong ruled the delta's rivers for years because, for a long and terribly costly stretch of the war, no one on the other side could take that water away from them. In the end, they lost that rule not to some wonder weapon dropped in from above, but to small boats, brave crews, helicopter gunships, and a plain willingness to follow the enemy into the worst possible ground and fight him there on his own terms. James Elliott Williams and the men like him proved something that reaches far beyond a few miles of canal. They proved that the side which controls the narrow water controls far more than just the water itself. It controls movement and supply, and in the end it controls the fate of the people who live along the banks. That was true on the Mekong in 1966, and it remains true on contested waterways around the world today. On the last day of October 1966, 2 fiberglass boats went up a branch of the Mekong chasing a single fleeing sampan, and instead they found an entire enemy movement waiting for them on the water. What happened over the next 3 hours reversed years of hard assumptions about who really owned those rivers. The enemy had crossed those channels for years, carrying the certainty that the water belonged to him, and always would. James Elliott Williams took that certainty apart in the space of an afternoon and an evening, with 2 boats, a searchlight, a few young sailors, and a flat refusal to run. He did not know it at the time, and he never would have claimed it for himself, but on that stretch of brown water, the balance of the entire river war had begun to shift. And it would keep shifting, patrol after patrol, until the guerrilla could no longer call the Mekong his own. 65 enemy boats went to the bottom, or to the flames on that single day, and the sailor who sent them there went quietly home, said very little about any of it, and let the river remember what he had done.